Our first guest speaker is former Governor Dr. J. Savage. The Honorable Ruben T. Meade was sworn into the office of the Montserrat's Premier on October 25th, 2024. This is Mr. Meade's second time serving as Premier. He became the island's first Premier when the position of Chief Minister changed in 2011, as the Montserrat's Constitution Order 2010 took effect. While he was serving in as the island's leader from 2011 to 2014, Mr. Meade became the youngest Chief Minister during his 1991 to 1996 tenure. Premier Meade's vast political experience extends beyond Montserrat's borders and renders him not only as a stalwart in the regional arena, but a luminary in the field of governance and legislative procedure. Francis J. Savage, our first speaker, served with distinction as Governor of Montserrat from 1993 to 1997. A period marked by the early and most critical phases of the Soufrière Hills Volcano. His steady leadership and deep commitment were instrumental in shaping Montserrat's initial disaster response and recovery strategies. Widely regarded as a true friend of Montserrat, Mr. Savage continues to maintain close ties with the island, which he still fondly considers his home. Following his impactful tenure in Montserrat, he was appointed Governor of the British Virgin Islands, Tortola, from 1998 to 2002, where he continued his legacy of public service and effective governance. From 2003 to 2016, Mr. Savage served as a consulate to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, advising on disaster mitigation and recovery, drawing on his extensive on-the-ground experience in managing crises in vulnerable island communities. In recognition of his expertise and lifelong dedication to the disaster resilience across the Commonwealth, Mr. Savage was appointed Chairman of the Commonwealth Disaster Management Agency, a position he currently holds. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. J. Savage, CMG, LVO, OBE, and the Honorable Premier Ruben T. Meade.
That's how we used to do it in the early days, so forgive us if we sometimes look like husband and wife. We're not.
Honourable Chief Minister, ladies and gentlemen, friends, this is my 10th visit back to Montserrat, and it really does feel like coming home. Unfortunately, my suitcase didn't get the same treatment as I did, and that's still on holiday in Antigua. And hence why I'm not wearing a business suit, as the program says. This session with the Premier and myself isn't particularly structured. But what I want to try to do is to set the scene from 1995, because things have moved on. The Montserrat volcanic crisis has been the subject of dozens or more of scientific papers, but we haven't really captured what it was on the ground in July 1995 when it started. I lecture at universities, high schools, colleges throughout the UK, and the message I'm very keen to get across is that Montserrat's story is a great success story, a success for the people of Montserrat, who are among the most resilient people I've ever come across. Montserrat is no stranger to disasters. If you go back into the 1920s, the earthquakes, and right through until the late 1980s, when Montserrat was hit by the most powerful hurricane that had struck a Caribbean country in the previous century, Hurricane Hugo. 11 people died and 90% of properties were damaged, and I think 30% were destroyed. That would have defeated most communities, but not Montserrat. With the help of their external friends and donors, and under the leadership of, I won't keep calling him the Premier, but my very good friend, Ruben, this community was put back together, and by 95, Plymouth looked magnificent, and the economy was at takeoff point. And then to have the cruelty of just at that point for a volcano which everybody had known about, but it was a soufrière. It was something which brought tourism to the island. It was never seen as being something malevolent and likely to cause the devastation it did. And that kicked off with virtually no precursor warnings, or nothing, no precursor warning that it was drawn to the attention of the Cabinet of Government. When I was briefing in London, I better keep an eye on the time here. When I was briefing in London to come out to Montserrat, the thing I picked up on was that whereas Montserrat was recovering from Hugo, it actually was bottom of the Caribbean league table for disaster preparedness, because all the resource, and in Montserrat, resource is small, precious, all the resource was being put into rebuilding the capital and the territory. And this business of Montserrat not being very well prepared for future disasters led me to go to Barbados on the way out, talk to, I don't know whether it was Sedima or Sedira in those days, one or the other, and equipped it with computers, weather charts, and a full-time head for the first time. And it was a cracking unit. We got a Caribbean expert to come in and to write the definitive book on disasters which were likely to affect Montserrat and how to put them right. But in July, when the volcano kicked off and we opened this very thick tome under V for volcanoes, it just said Montserrat has a volcano. So there was a lot of feeling that we'd wasted money, we'd set up an EOC which hadn't targeted itself on volcanoes. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, because this small EOC became the very center of the heartbeat of Montserrat's response to the volcano. Ruben and I were at the I won't say which, saying tomorrow morning we're leaving on the first flight out of here because the situation is too difficult. We're 4 miles from the volcano, and one of our colleagues, observing from 6 miles away, was killed in the eruption at Mount St. Helens. So Ruben and I asked for 6 hours for them to contemplate. And when we went back at 10 o'clock in the morning, we got all the scientists to give us their private thoughts. And the two who were concerned was for very understandable and acceptable reasons. They had, but in their opinion, this volcano would give us adequate notice if it was going to go to full eruption. And with that, the younger scientists said they would sign on and stay, but on the proviso, we moved the MVO from its first site in Kitty Field, and it went overnight to the Viewpoint Hotel. And from there, it went to a more permanent base a few months later. That had to be handled very carefully because the community were avid for information. The radio station carried twice daily bulletins, and I think the Montserrat community became the best educated community anywhere in the world at listening to and responding to advice about their volcano. It didn't happen overnight. When the first scientists arrived, we asked them whether they would go onto the radio and explain, whether they were going to the schools and give lessons. And the answer to which was very understandable. We're working 24/7 on trying to find out what this thing is likely to do. We understand the need for it, but we cannot provide that. And that came in time as more and more younger scientists arrived, including PhD students working out of the MVO. I think the scientists themselves decided that the younger scientists were the ones to set up an education program. So there was then a system of school visits, village lectures, and the senior scientists by that time were prepared to come and do a daily slot on the radio. I mean, communities like this, and it's the same in the UK, parents and grandparents usually didn't have the education that the children of today have access to. And here in Montserrat, I'd have thought that half or more of the grandparents had never gone beyond primary school. And it was a brilliant concept. The young scientists went in to junior schools, secondary schools, on a weekly basis, talking about the dangers, the terminology. And the young kids went home and taught their grandparents. And even grandparents, I mean, you can go to a rum shot at 11 o'clock at night, you'd find 3 70-year-old men discussing, the attributes of pyroclastic flows against lahars. It was wonderful. Now, coupled to that, another thing that set Montserrat apart, you've got all this knowledge, how do you disperse it? We were fortunate that we had one of the best radio stations in the Caribbean, and we had by far the most outstanding presenter, Rose Willock. And Rose became the mouthpiece of the government. She was never hurried, she was never flustered, and even the most urgent of things, she put it across, hosted programs with all the scientists. And even when the Caribbean, I mean, Montserrat was hit by 3 hurricanes and, well, 1 hurricane and 2 tropical storms in the autumn of 1993. And Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis all went down. Their radio stations were not operating. So they were all phoning in to Rose, who in between what she was doing here, Rose was passing on message that Aunt Josie in Antigua is safe, and she sends her regards to cousins in St. Kitts. So communication is also one of the critical areas. And here in Montserrat, in a very, very short period of time, we started ticking most of the boxes. We had a very, very effective EOC, which not only handled the scientific part, the relation to the scientists, the action needed to be taken on a daily basis. But as more and more civil servants left the island, EOC really became a mini cabinet office, doing many of the functions of government, and doing it to a brilliantly high standard. Just coming back to the elicitation, it was decided that we needed a senior British scientist to come to brief both myself and the British government, and Dr. or Professor Willie Aspinall arrived. And Willie was the very first scientist who carried out a proper elicitation exercise in the region of volcanology. It had previously only been used in the oil industry, where before a company drilled down to 5 miles at a cost of 50 million, they wanted some reassurance that it was a wise investment. Well, Willie brought that to seismology and volcanology, and I think it is now used widely around the world. We got a lot of scientists coming from around the world to help us, but we also got scientists coming to learn from us. The Japanese came over to look at how we were doing hazard mapping and contingency plans for moving the community. I can't tell you how many times we ordered evacuations, but every time we did, it was to effectively the barren north of Montserrat, where there was very little infrastructure. And we had people living in church halls, in churches, and up to 1,000 at one time in tents. This was all handled brilliantly by Montserratians. We had a conference a few years ago where we were actually looking at the social effects of the volcano. I've just done 2 church services in London for the 30th anniversary, where I must have met 70 or 80 Montserratians who I evacuated to England, or who I assisted to evacuate to England. And they speak with a passion about their homeland. They're up to date with everything you do. So I think as a territory, I think as a community, you can and should take great pride with the way this volcanic eruption has been handled. It appears now to be at a stage where it's not threatening the communities, because people have been moved well away. And long may that last, as Montserrat is now looking at economic development with some very exciting projects in the wings. I'm sure I've forgotten to thank people. I didn't mention the nurses or the teachers who were also part of those who wanted to stay remaining on island. We took a decision very early on. This was from the Americans. You cannot force people to evacuate. You have to persuade them. If you force them, have you got enough troops, enough resources to stop them going back? Because in the case of Mount St. Helens, where they lost 65 people, they didn't have sufficient resource. And we clearly didn't here in Montserrat. We brought in 100 Royal Marines right at the start, but that simply didn't work. And so it was decided evacuation on island, evacuation off island had to be a voluntary decision, and we would work with the families once they had made their decision. I've eaten very badly into Ruben's time. My apologies. I'm around all week, and there's nothing I like more than talking about Montserrat. Please come and see me.
Thanks very much, Frank. That's how we used to do it in the day. The governor always went first.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Montserrat Cultural Center.
We never used to have that. The governor used to go first, and I followed. That's the protocol. But I just want to look very briefly, and my theme here are the ramblings of a premier. So it's totally unstructured, makes no sense, but as a politician, sometimes we make no sense whatsoever. My colleague, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, welcome my brother. He was trained in Montserrat, went back to Trinidad, and then became Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. So at least we have done something good, right? The journey of the MVO. The MVO started in Plymouth. And as Frank said, the scientists wanted to leave because they had the experience of some of their colleagues dying in Pinatubo and Mount St. Helens. But as we said to them, if you leave, that sends a very bad signal to the residents who are saying you can remain. So we want you to stay as long as possible in Plymouth until it's time for us to move everybody. We then left the MVO, we went to the Viewpoint Hotel, spent some time there, then moved to a villa just some distance up the hill, then all the way over to the north, where they couldn't see the volcano, and then we built the MVO as we currently know it. Frank and I, every night, went on the radio to speak to the population about what was happening at the Soufrière Hills Volcano. At one stage, I said to Frank, I think the people are tired of us, so we're going to stop this thing. And we actually stopped. And I got home, and a certain friend of mine from Upper Flemings, I'm not going to call his name, called me around midnight-ish and said to me, Ruben, my wife can't sleep. And I said, you're lying in bed with your wife, and you're calling me to tell your wife can't sleep? What can I do about it? And he says, you're always making stupid jokes, you know. We cannot go to sleep until you guys tell us it's okay to go and sleep. We never realized that it was that important to the people. So we went back in. I called Frank and I said, Bruds, we have to do this thing again. I'm going to fast forward. Whilst we set up the observatory and monitored, there are certain things which clearly we could not see. We did not realize that the dome had broken through the surface. And it was one Kevin West who, God bless his soul, he was always on the top of the hill taking photographs, called me and said, Ruben, there's something black coming out from inside there. And that was the first time we were then going up to Chance's Peak to look at that growing dome. We were picking up the seismic signals, but we did not realize it had broken through. Young scientists, and God made young people for a reason. Simon Young, as a young scientist, decided he wanted to get a sample of that new material. So he went got the helicopter to lower him on a bucket, put the bucket down, and you can imagine what happened to the bucket, which was metal. Disappeared. Because the thing was too hot. But they insisted that they wanted to get a sample, and they finally found a way of getting that sample. But it also meant that because I was a little fitter than I am now, we were going up to Chance's Peak several times per week. And because I had to be on radio, I then went with them to see for myself. I'm like doubting Thomas in the Bible. I had to go and see for myself what was happening so that I can report at the end of the night. Finally, the scientists decided, or they were finally convinced, that they can take over going on radio. And they went into the community, and the name Dr. Ambe then became a household name. Lloyd Lynch, Richie Robertson, and the others became household names because they then took over, went into the community, and started telling the people what we could not have told them. Of course, when you are a politician, with people leaving their houses and going to live in shelters. For example, my house, we had 18 persons living in my house. People were living in churches. People were living in schools. It was not nice. So an election comes up in 1996. The opposition can always tell you they should have done it better, they should have had shelters built, they should have had this, they should have had that. We lost the election in 1996. I then took the opportunity to go into private life, become a contractor, to help rebuild Montserrat by being in the construction industry. Didn't know a thing about what I was doing, but people hired us anyway. Coming back into government, we determined too many government offices were still in people's bedrooms and in their living rooms. So we decided we have to build a permanent accommodation for the government offices. So people started saying, no, he's a builder, so all he's thinking about is building, building, building. But you have a country that was decimated. You must build. We built houses, we built government offices, we built the radio station, etc., etc. But we focused a lot of attention not only on government accommodation. We looked at building a new port, funded, totally funded by one of the United Emirates States. Unfortunately, that agreement happened in 2014. The development of Little Bay and the waterfront area, the restaurants and so forth you see around there, we built those because we were building a tourism industry. We cut down a little hill across there called Potato Hill to facilitate the port. We filled in a pond called Piper's Pond, which is being occupied currently. And pretty much all of the buildings, other than this one, were built during that 2009-2014 era. As with all good politicians, you lose an election again. And we ended up what I call the lost decade. Having lost the election after 25 years in active politics, I decided, no, it's time to retire, go look after your grandchildren and enjoy life. And I think Keith understands that. I hope you don't come back just like me. But all of the projects which we started came to an end. Every one of them came to an end. Nothing on the port, nothing in Little Bay, nothing on Piper's Pond, no further buildings of government accommodation, 4 houses built by government in 10 years. The MDC, or the Montserrat Development Corporation, which was supposed to look at the private sector development for Montserrat, that was closed. The project implementation unit, that was closed. Stagnation for 10 years. I'm now back out of retirement. And as every good politician, you tell the lie and say, look, people ask you to come back. So I am back with a new team. The volcano has provided us with many opportunities, and we must make the most of them. It is time for us to stop looking at the volcano as something tragic and look at the opportunities that can be created as a consequence of our little volcano. Our major export is sand, which comes from the volcano. Every day there's a barge going out of Montserrat loaded with volcanic sand and also volcanic aggregate. We're looking at the private sector in terms of focusing a lot on getting not only local investors, but foreign direct investment into Montserrat. The volcano should not stop us from rebuilding Montserrat and the northern part of Montserrat. Hotel and tourism, we have to get hotel and tourism up and going. We have a 1.5 hotel, 1.5 hotels here. Viewpoint, we're going to have a chat on Viewpoint later, Carol. If we do not go into developing our economy, we will be back here 30 years later talking about our volcano, when in fact we should be talking about they had a volcano, it was active, and look at what transformed or transformation took place in the country. And that's the focus. We're focusing on access as well. You came in on some little itsy bitsy planes. We're hoping that by next month, we'll be doubling the size of those planes. We have to take it one step at a time. So we'll be using the 19-seaters. We're currently using the 19-seaters coming out of St. Martin, and we're hoping that SVG will be using their 19-seaters coming out of Antigua so that it will make things a lot easier. And then once we have that sorted out, we'll then start looking at the ferry operations. So you take it sequentially rather than trying to bite off too much and get choked. Agricultural development, people say the ash is good for your soil. Too much of anything is not good, eh? But we're looking at doubling our agricultural production over the next 12 months. And the Minister for Agriculture is sitting on the front seat, and he nodded and he seems to say, yes, we're going to do it. To facilitate that, we're providing agricultural grants, but we're also providing small loans to the agricultural sector so that farmers, fishers can borrow soft loans from the Bank of Montserrat to help them to develop their productive capabilities. Too much grant everybody wants. Once you have something in the game, the focus will be greater. Micro-enterprise development, we're also focusing on that, but again, that would be through principally soft loans going through the Bank of Montserrat, so that we're looking at the holistic development of Montserrat moving forward. You drive around, you'll see all the mangoes dropping off the trees. We can utilize those mangoes through micro-enterprise so that we have something which we can say we can export other than our sand. And the good thing is, because of the volcanic situation, It seems as though we have mangoes almost every month of the year. There's no longer a mango season. There's no longer a guava season, etc. Seems that we're flourishing. So let us look very positively at the volcanic situation. Let us look positively at Montserrat as a country that should be moving forward. And trust me, you come back here in 5 years' time, this Montserrat will look much differently to what you're seeing now. There are a couple other things, and I just want to go back down memory lane. Everything seems to have gone very well over the years. They have not. The British government has been very, very helpful and very supportive, and for that we give thanks. But there was a time when they wanted all of us off Montserrat. I got a call from my colleague and friend, the Prime Minister of Barbados, the late, great Owen Arthur. He was watching cricket, and let's just leave it as he was watching cricket. Don't think back 24 hours, okay? We're embarrassed over the past 24 hours. And he said to me, Ruben, I am taking 1,000 persons from Montserrat. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, no, the British High Commission has come to us as regional heads to ask us to take people from Montserrat because you're too busy to make the call to them. I said, Owen, you're my friend. If I needed your help, I would have called you. These are games that were being played. Camp Lightfoot in Antigua, where they tried to get us into Camp Lightfoot. And I said, hell no, we're not going there. If you want us, let us go to the United Kingdom, because we should be treated the same way as any other British citizen. So therefore, let us go to the United Kingdom. Fortunately, in 1998, that became a real possibility for all. We became British citizens. So the journey has been long. It has been tough. And the very unfortunate thing is, I started my journey with Hurricane Hugo as a technician. People thought I did a good job managing the recovery after that. They asked me to get involved in politics. The year after I got involved in politics and we started the rebuilding, the volcano started. The politician said, if you vote for Ruben, the volcano will continue. They didn't vote for me. Well, they didn't vote for my team. But then they voted for me in 2009 after the volcano was quiet for a while. And 2010, the big eruption took place. I'm back now. Let's hope that the same thing doesn't happen again, otherwise I'm out of here. So, whilst we have all of you wonderful scientists here, and many of you have been here many a time, you're here to be part of a conference. But do take the opportunity to enjoy Montserrat, because Montserrat's still nice. Montserrat's still home. Montserrat is paradise. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you very much to former Governor Savage and the Honorable Premier for their remarks.
I don't know. We're taking questions?
We're gonna, yes, but I'm gonna introduce this person first.
Okay, so. Okay.
We're going to invite the audience, having heard the remarks and insights of our two speakers, to ask any questions that they have. We're going to give about 10 minutes to our Q&A session.
Okay, there being no questions.
Any questions, anyone?
It became the M on it, when you went to Antigua to do shopping as we used to do, if your money has an M on it, it's no good. And I remember going into a supermarket here once, and a lady, a little old lady, pulled out her $20, bought 2 pounds of chicken and some other things to go home and cook. And when she went to pay, they said, "Sorry, this money is no good." The lady broke down and cried. As a good citizen, I said to her, "It's okay, I will pay for it." That was the extent of what happened during that time when that money was evacuated from Plymouth.
Hi, I have a question for Premier Meade as well. What place do you see for tourism related to the volcano in the future 5 years development of the economy of Montserrat?
Okay, we have what we call the buried city. Unfortunately, Plymouth has been locked off and there's been no development in Plymouth. St. George's Hill, which gives a fantastic view of Plymouth, has been locked off for years. What we're hoping to do is that for the next tourist season, we'll have St. George's Hill and Plymouth reopened, where we will be putting up signage, both in Plymouth and St. George's Hill with QR codes, so that when persons are traversing, then they can see what was there. They can see what is currently, and then they can see what was there. And then they can capture the QR code so that they can go and look in more detail if they so desire. So that's the principal focus on tourism. Lots and lots of our cruise passengers want to come just to go to the buried city. The other area of interest is the MVO, because Montserrat had the first recorded pyroclastic flow that floated on the sea. We're not saying it's the first that it happened, but it's the first recorded. So we had it on video, and that became a big hit. So there are things which we're going to do with the volcano. So as I said in my brief ramblings, we're not looking forward at the volcano as something damaging and destructive. We're looking at it as something very positive which could be utilized. As we said, we're already using the sand in aggregate, and currently we have a company that is interested in the ash for doing some productive enterprise here. Additionally, we had 2 geothermal wells, production wells dug in 2013, and in the last decade, nothing happened. What we're doing actively now is seeking to have those geothermal wells developed so that we can produce power. There's a young gentleman here from Oxford University with his team. Not going to call any name, because there are several of them from Oxford University and the Oxford Institute, where we will be flowing the wells at the end of September, where they will be doing some mineralogy work for us as well.
Good morning. So yesterday we had a very interesting panel discussion. Coming out of that panel discussion was the recognition that the rest of the Caribbean community may not have learned as much from Montserrat, the experience of Montserrat, and may not be doing enough in terms of putting plans in place to deal with a volcanic crisis. Good. One of the comments that came out specifically from Dr. Rowley was that even though he recognized that the politicians bear the responsibility to secure the safety of its citizens, putting plans in place to deal with the volcanic risk may be something that they do not want to do for economic reasons. Good. Interestingly, Frankie and I were discussing that this morning. And one of the points that he brought up was that in the Caribbean, where there is often change in the executive, when the opposition comes into power, the files tend to disappear mysteriously. So my question is, given the setup in Montserrat where the governor has the responsibility for disaster management, probably you could comment on the advantages of that type of setup and whether it is something that could be replicated in the other islands, i.e., transfer some of those responsibilities to the Governor General or the President in some islands, good, so that whenever there is transition, you do not have such a discontinuity. Is it possible for you to comment on the advantages of having that responsibility?
I have to be careful with a senior politician in the room. It is not that files disappear because the civil service continues. So the files are actually kept by the public servants and not the politicians. What we tend to find happening is that there are things which we don't want to know. So if you look at what happened in St. Vincent, Richie Robertson, who came along with you in the early days and learned his trade here, was able to do a lot of work in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The other institution that's very, very important is the SRC. And we have to find a mechanism where institutions such as the SRC are properly funded. Because too often, we want to do other sexy things with our money, and the key institutions in the region are not funded. Now, let's take Dominica, for example. Every time that there's a rumbling, I think of Dominica, because, as was pointed out yesterday, Roseau is pretty much surrounded by volcanoes. And if you had to evacuate Roseau, Dominica, it would be even more tragic than evacuating Plymouth in Montserrat. So we have to learn lessons from one another. As political colleagues, we tend to wait until something is happening before we get active. We get hurricanes every year. How active are we in terms of mitigation for hurricanes? That's an annual event, you know it's going to happen. As to which island or how many islands it's going to impact, we don't know. But to a great extent, we sit and we say, bye-bye, let it go south, let it go north, let it go to the United States. And we don't do enough as politicians to do what is required. So CDEMA, for example, is also not properly funded. Okay, so these are things which we have to deal with in the CARICOM region, where CARICOM takes a more leading role. Both CARICOM and OECS takes a more leading role working with CDEMA and with SRC in terms of documenting some of these things and moving them forward. John?
There are many impediments to economic development and growth. To what extent would you say that the very high electricity tariff, the abnormally high electricity tariff on Montserrat, for all sorts of reasons, is a real barrier to economic development?
The abnormally high the electricity tariffs clearly impacts on everything. Reduce electricity cost by more than 50%. And therefore we have to focus a lot of attention on that, plus their ancillary industries which can come as a consequence of geothermal production.
Okay. Yeah, so Governor Savage was mentioning in the early days that there was a lot of different opinions from scientists about what the volcano was going to do. And so to kind of unpack kind of psychologically as the decision makers, what is it like when you're seeing this uncertainty in real time about what's going to happen and these very big consequences of evacuating or people getting killed, and you have these completely different opinions?
Because Montserrat is so small and the volcano was up close and intimate, a youngster by the name of Dr. Ambe, who was heading the MVO at the time, felt you have to learn to live with your volcano. And it is our job as scientists to monitor it sufficiently so that we do not evacuate persons too soon or unnecessarily. That view was not necessarily held by all of the scientists, because remember, some of them had the experience of losing colleagues in Pinatubo and in Mount St. Helens. So therefore, that impacted significantly on the discord. We brought in a youngster by the name of Willie Aspinall, and Willie then came in and then became the senior scientist who functioned now as a coordinator of all of those views and opinions within the MVO. And then you were able to come out with one concerted opinion coming from the MVO. So in other words, we let all ideas contend. You had your difficulties within the observatory and very heated discussions as well. But once Willie put together that system, then the scientists were able to speak freely, and then by consensus, that view came to us, and then we moved forward based on that. And I'll give one example. We did not have these little funny gadgets back then. Frank and I went to the radio station in Plymouth around midnight because we were told you need to evacuate persons tomorrow morning. And we figured, let's get a leg up on it and go and make the announcement. So we pre-recorded the announcement, and when we came out of the radio station, there was already a line of vehicles along the road waiting to see both of us coming out. And then they followed us out. So persons were very attuned to what we were doing and attuned to what the scientists were doing. But the loss of the 19 lives was not as a consequence of poor management or poor monitoring. It was simply that persons snuck into the zone when they should not have gone there. Interestingly, you had a couple of scientists coming in from the airport, and they wanted to come through the central corridor. And for some reason, they decided not to go through there. Had they gone through the central corridor, it would be sweet goodbyes. So this is how it was. But again, the scientific community will always have differences of opinion. Scientists are almost as bad as economists. We make decisions based on a whole range of things, and this economist will not necessarily agree with that one. Same thing with scientists. But in the end, once you pool your thoughts together and you're able to sift out what is unnecessary, then proper decisions are made.
I respectfully disagree with you that the lives that were lost was not as a result of management. As the chief scientist during the period of May, a few days before that fateful eruption, I went to Austin Bramble, who was the Minister of Agriculture, and pleaded with him to get those farmers removed from that area. And that was after we had a community meeting with the farmers. Good. And Willie Aspinall took over 2 weeks after I left. Well, within 2 weeks after I left, Willie Aspinall was a chief scientist when the fateful eruption took place. Good. But there was some discourse as regards to getting those people out of the northern corridor. Good. Part of the discourse was that to explore whether the British government could find some way to indemnify the farmers or compensate them for the crops that were in place at the time. Good. So there probably needs to be some investigation of that.
I'll accept that I'm about 50% correct. Frank?
I mean, you're quite right about the people who remained in Harris Village. It wasn't for the lack of effort to bring them out. Even Dr. Fergus in the previous weekend had gone up with a small team, and he came very close to being struck by a pyroclastic flow with his team. I think in Harris's and in St. Patrick's, we were constantly going in, trying to persuade people to come out. I went to St. Patrick's every Saturday for, I think, 4 weeks. And each time I went down there, there were more and more people. It's probably because when I talked to them, I bought them a beer in the Spread Eagle bar. But we had taken a decision very early on that we could not force people to leave. We did, of course, bring a few people out against their wishes, but invariably they found their way back in again. So Ruben and I reached a point where did we risk the lives of young Montserrat police officers and members of the Royal Montserrat Defence Force going in every weekend to search for people who had stayed. And we reached a stage where the Defence Force and the police force themselves were saying we are risking the lives of our own officers. So I do accept that we knew there were people in Harris's. A determined attempt was made, first of all, by, I was off island, but Sir Howard Fergus, went in to try to bring them out. And I know that other members of the government also did the same. It was a desperately difficult situation. We knew the conditions in the north of the island were desperate for the poorer people. They were offered passage to England, but I mean, some of them were in their 90s and simply didn't want to leave the village of their birth. They were not sacrificed, I can assure you, and indeed everyone from Harris's was brought out on the fateful day.
Question for Governor Savage. Do you have any advice on how we convince the UK government that a modest investment in the island of Montserrat is going to be transformational for Montserrat, but also in the UK's longer-term interest? And how do we influence the UK government in that regard?
I'm an advisor to a parliamentary committee which just represents the overseas territories. So there's, I won't call it powerful, but it's quite an influential body, about 6 or 8 MPs and members of the House of Lords. And we have been banging away on this now for 30 years. The British government hasn't been unsympathetic. We have at times had British governments who were more pro the overseas territories, and Montserrat in particular. There have been other times when we have had some secretaries of state saying they'd be expecting golden elephants next, or money, they think money grows on trees. The effort has never stopped. I was just talking to Ruben before we came on stage to say I think Montserrat needs to beef up its presence and representation in London. The government will always respond to its members of parliament. There's great sympathy for Montserrat. There isn't an MP who doesn't know about Montserrat and is sympathetic. But you know the British government's aid programme has been hacked, tempted to say savagely. It's now only worth a third of what it was when we were at the height of the crisis. But the battle goes on. We've just got to find a way of raising Montserrat's profile. I can tell you, I was a governor who, Claire Short in the Department of Overseas Development used to stick pins into an effigy of me. It wasn't for the lack of articulating Montserrat's case.
I just want to put a little perspective on what we're discussing here now, which is the response to basically a permanent situation that requires urgent, direct, and sustained attention. And not to be too critical of the effort that had been made here in Montserrat and the success. I don't know how many of you know how close we came to having a far more traumatic outcome in that fateful June period in 1997. Because once the decision was made that you wouldn't enforce the conditions for evacuation, it was left to people determining, some people determining what risk they are prepared to accept. And even where there is an example of enforcement, as in the case of St. Helens, when the government with the most resources available, there was no shortage of resources at St. Helens, and the volcano was extremely dangerous, and the population was forced out. There was one man who stayed at Spirit Lake, hasn't been seen since. But the people were forced out in a situation where there was great danger in the face of it. But even while they were out, those people started putting pressure on the government to be allowed to go back to their homes, if only for a short period. And the powerful United States government agreed eventually to allow them to go home for, I think, 3 hours or 4 hours, something like that. And they were assembling in a car park to go in, and the volcano erupted at that time when they were all assembled there, just about to take off to go home. And had the volcano erupted a few hours later, the outcome would have been hugely more disastrous. Now, in Montserrat, I came in here a few days before that climatic eruption. I came in the afternoon on the last flight into that airport, and I was taken straight to a meeting at the governor's residence with Willie Aspinall. And Willie had briefed me before about the conversation that had to be had from a scientist to the governor, because that was an area of potential fracture. And I came in and took part in the conversation without having gone to the volcano yet, but I was in touch along the way. And the next night, Willie and I went out to view the mountain, see how close we can get. And there were lights in Cork Hill. And I came back to the meeting the next day and asked, why were there so many lights on in Cork Hill? Only to be told that there were people who were going back to Cork Hill to sleep because it was so uncomfortable in the shelters. And my input then was that this is serious. Cork Hill needs to be cleared out completely and kept clear, because if we move to the next phase of a collapse of that dome, you're not going to have much time to get out of Cork Hill. And on the day when the eruption actually took place and pyroclastic flow came down in the valley at Cork Hill, there were children in the schoolyard. And the surge, a small surge, came out of that valley onto the road above Cork Hill School, came down the road, and it was mango season like now, and there were a lot of mangoes on the road. That surge came down right above the road, above Cork Hill School, and every mango in the road was carbonized. It was one of the interesting things. There was enough fine deposit on the road carrying enough heat to carbonize every mango on the road. And for me, that was like every child in the school and every person in Cork Hill. And if you are doing civil defense, there will be occasions where the authorities may have to have a heavier hand to protect people from themselves. Or if you leave it to them, like the guy who I knew personally at the airport, he was working at the airport. I know him by meeting him in the airport. He went home up to Harris to take a 5 at lunchtime. He was one of the 19 people who disappeared. Intelligent, trained person, knew a lot about the volcano, working under the flank of the volcano, but took a chance to go home and take a 5 at lunchtime. But there was no person there saying to him, you can't pass. And there was no person saying to the MVO staff, overlooking the eruption from the lookout at the airport, getting my first clear close-up view in the daytime, when I heard on the radio a couple of our young scientists asking for permission to go through the corridor. And I had to break into that transmission, and it was all permission denied, because a quick run across that corridor, as against coming around here to be on the lookout there with me, could have seen us losing junior scientific staff, because when the eruption took place, it is quite possible that those young scientists could have been in that corridor. And that road has disappeared since, along with the big church, and that is the kind of thing that goes on during eruptions. And Montserrat came very close to having a far worse outcome, even though we have an outcome that we can look at and say we made the best of what was available. And the people who took the decisions ought to be given some credit for allowing decision-making to be shared or to be fashioned by that relationship between the Prime Minister and the Governor. I don't know that that is common or that would be available in other eruptions. And I hope tomorrow to mention a little bit about the lessons that should be learned that Montserrat would have taught to the region, which are not being learned. Because I can tell you right now, there are other potential disasters within this region for which we are hopelessly unprepared, because we believe that the volcanoes either would give us enough notice, or worse, it's not going to happen on my watch.
Keith, would you mind if, or Dr. Rowley, would you mind if I just reply to the bit about the Cork Hill School? I remember like it was only yesterday, at 7 o'clock in the morning, you called Ruben and myself, and you took us up above the Cork Hill School. you showed us a scorched earth 200, 300 meters from the school. We were all shocked to the core. Over the previous week, there had been, I'd almost call it a raging debate in the MVO about Cork Hill and should we move the people out. The scientific consensus was it was not the moment to do it. We didn't receive advice that it's sufficiently close, we think you ought to move Cork Hill. The advice was at the moment all the outfall is going to the east, nothing has come in that direction. And as you pointed out, that brought home to us for probably the first time that you can't predict with that degree of accuracy. And we moved Cork Hill immediately with all the problems it created, because Cork Hill, I don't know, must have been 700 or 800 people to the north of the island where there was no space whatsoever. We never, ever once took a decision against the advice of the scientists. It sometimes took an extra 24 hours to hone in on what the precise advice was. But Ruben and I never ever, is that true, Ruben? We never ever went against any advice from the scientists. Now, I know the scientists are advisors. If they get it wrong, it looks bad on their CV. If we get it wrong, or me in particular, we are accountable to a court. And I've stood between two courts which could have handed down a manslaughter sentence, possibly of 10 years, for doing our job. So we were very aware of our responsibilities. We always wanted to err on the side of safety, but we knew every time we tried to put pressure on people to move into an area where we knew it was not sustainable, the people would come back overnight. We had no means of policing the exclusion zones. The farmers knew the routes over the fields through the tracks. If we had a magic wand, we wouldn't have had the 19 fatalities. It could have been so much worse. Mount St. Helens, 65. Martinique, 29,000. We're not claiming credit, but I think we're saying we acted responsibly at all times, knowing that our personal views were to get everybody 10 miles away. So we didn't have 10 miles, and the majority of the people we were talking to simply didn't want to be evacuated off island. So we did try.
The handlers are saying that's the end of it, and they wish to move on to the next presenter, Mr. Michael. But I just want to make one closing statement, and Keith would understand this. When politicians decide that they want to play politics with people's lives, things like this happen. The chief minister of the day was seeking to have a confrontation with the British government where he was saying, if you do not do something about compensating our people, then I will allow certain things to happen. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers for answering those questions. Thank you to the audience for your participation. We do want to move swiftly on to our next guest speaker, Franklin V. Michael. Franklin V. Michael is a national of Antigua and Barbuda. He took up residence in Montserrat in 1978 and remained there until the volcanic eruptions forced the migration of his family in the late 1990s. His career spans more than 40 years in education, agriculture, management, organizational development, strategic planning, leadership, training, communications, and the Emergency Department, now known as the Disaster Management Coordination Agency, DMCA. He led teams that had primary non-security and non-military responsibilities for responding to the volcanic crisis for 4 years from 1995 to 1999. Mr. Michael started work at the Caribbean Center for Development Administration, CARICAD, in Barbados in 2005 and held multiple positions. He is there now as a supplementary associate consultant. He has facilitated the development of many strategic plans and organizational planning frameworks in several Caribbean countries. He has been an experienced trainer, workshop facilitator, and webinar presenter. Mr. Michael has a Bachelor's of Science in General Agriculture from the University of the West Indies and a Master of Science in the Agricultural Development from the University of London and a diploma in Project Planning from the University of Bradford, England. He was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1996 for his operational leadership of the response to the volcanic crisis in Montserrat during the earliest days of the crisis. He was in place from the very first evening on July 18, 1995. He is a Calypsonian, poet, debating, he's shouting at me from the sidelines, you see. He is a calypso lyricist, poet, and debating and public speaking coach. He is a sports commentator for many years in Montserrat and the BVI. He is married to a distinguished Monstrantian woman. They are the proud parents of 2 professionally accomplished Monstrantian daughters. Join me in giving a warm welcome to Franklin V. Michael.
Good morning, everyone. And I hope you will understand that this presentation now has to be condensed significantly. So if it's a little choppy, you'll appreciate we're trying to stay on schedule. And I am not going to be relying on PowerPoint, I'm going to be relying on text. Because the story of what happened with the volcano in those first few years is not a PowerPoint story. It's not. And 6 bullets per slide, 6 words per line can't tell it. So I'm relying on text. Now, I didn't sleep at all the night of July 18th, 1995. The evening, about 6, I got a call from our then National Disaster Coordinator, Ms. Juliet Braid. And she said, Mr. Michael, H.E. would like to speak with you. H.E. at that time was Governor Frank Savage. And he came on the phone right away. And in his particular style of speech, he said, Frankie, the volcano is acting up. We need you to report to the EOC immediately. So I reported immediately. One day in 1995, when there was a spontaneous evacuation of Plymouth, there were 2 vehicles heading south. 2. Every other vehicle was heading north. One vehicle was being driven by my wife, going for our children who were at school in Plymouth, and the other vehicle was being driven by me, heading for the EOC at that time, which you've heard before, was on the police compound. In words that have become famous recently in Montserrat, I was there. My family was there. Risk for us wasn't some arcane concept in a textbook. It was real personally. It was real professionally. Please remember I said this has to be the condensed version. So if it's a little choppy, please accept. But it's important for us to look back and understand what was at risk when we talk about Montserrat. We talk about verdant hills and mountains, gently sloping land, truly, truly arable land producing food, fresh food. We think about a place where communities raised children and children were respectful. We think about a place where major musical artists wanted to come to your studios. We think about a place where all of us at Christmas seem to take on a different persona. And the tranquility for 1 month was transformed into excitement and activity. We had utilities that worked reliably. We had good roads. Our telecommunications were as good as the rest of the region. And at that point, think about this. Montserrat had graduated in terms of its budgetary assistance from support for its recurrent budget. Now, for those of you familiar, today Montserrat's recurrent budget is supported 68% by the British government. Those are the kinds of things that were at risk. This is not, again, some arcane, remote concept of risk. This was life. This was livelihood. This meant that 70% of the population on this island who lived in their own homes were very likely going to lose their homes. And when people said, but why don't they leave? Why don't they leave? Think of your situation. You will make the biggest investment of your life, because I say all of this conscious of a sense of self and a sense of history. For many of us, our home was our biggest investment. And then you say to us casually, why don't you leave? We don't have enough time this morning for me to explain to you all the reasons why people would find it hard to leave their own homes. But that's our reality. Montserrat was valuable once. This island once produced 1 million pounds of cotton. Very valuable. This island once had 7,000 acres of land under cotton. What made Montserrat valuable then made it vulnerable in 1995. It was largely the pattern of development as a function of history that made us so vulnerable. Now, you've heard Governor Savage say, H.E., it's difficult. I called you H.E. for years, and I called you H.E. in Montserrat, and then I went to BVI for 4 years and had to call you H.E. for 2 of that. Please understand. There was no practical opportunity for preparedness. None. And I know that those who hold perspectives about scientific information being available. I said already I was there, and I'm still here now, thankfully, because I'll say one thing. If the scientific information about risk was so readily available, how is it that all of us were still able to get insurance coverage for earthquakes and volcanic events until 1995? Think about that. And I'll be happy during the course of the break to discuss it even further, because I know it is one of those things where the people who were leading the civilian response at the time were accused of lacking foresight and lacking vision and not paying attention to scientific information. Yes, I'm passionate about this. because it was the lives and livelihood and well-being and welfare of thousands of people, virtually every one of whom I knew personally, interacted with, lived with, and around. It's not an easy thing to stand here and talk about this as though I'm presenting some sort of abstract presentation to people who may understand and may hope to understand. Let's just think quickly about some of the effects. Montserrat's vulnerability to the volcanic events was multidimensional. The impact on the economic infrastructure was particularly severe. For those of us who are old enough to know, that quaint setting meant a lot to all of us. We can't see that now. Think of what that means. That's the heart of old Plymouth. We can't see it. I visit Montserrat and I can't see it. We lost the major seaport. It was made unusable in the early years. The hospital, the library, the government headquarters, the radio stations, many schools, police stations, hotels, supermarkets, the public market, prison, telecommunications headquarters for private sector companies were among the major facilities destroyed or damaged or rendered inaccessible. The effect on the social sector, though more difficult to quantify, was severe. Education was especially hard hit. Many school facilities were destroyed or rendered inaccessible in devastated areas. Classes were disrupted. Syllabi could not be completed. Practical classes had to be eliminated. The entire education program had to be relocated. We needed the established school buildings to use as shelters, and we had to make alternate arrangements for schools using tents and other covered areas. The health sector experienced tremendous hardship. The island's only hospital was refurbished after Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989. It was about to be recommissioned when the volcanic event started. The hospital was forced to occupy a primary school building with the attendant health management service morale considerations. We were wearing masks long before the COVID-19 pandemic made wearing masks fashionable. We were wearing masks as a means of defending ourselves and our health against the ash. Now, the decline in the island's population, which you've heard about, moved from 10,000 to 3,500 by 1998. And that was one of the most onerous and long-lasting effects. The challenges included the direct losses that people sustain, homes and other buildings, investments in real property. There are families on this island that lost 40, 50 acres of land effectively. That's what we're talking about. So when we talk about risk and we talk about what was at stake, I'm trying to paint a picture in a very short period of time, as you recognize, of what we lost. Now, the non-material effects were principally brought on by the conditions of relocation. With many relatives, you heard no less a personage than the Honorable Premier himself saying there were 14 people in his house. There was a situation one day where a young lady was reporting late for work, and when we conducted a quiet little investigation, we discovered there was 21 people in the house she was staying in, and she had a young baby, so she had to wait to be last to use the bathroom to help herself and her baby get ready for the morning. Now, I would have liked to have gone into some detail about the emergency operations, structure, purpose, priorities, all of that. But perhaps there'll be another occasion. I will move now straight away to what I consider some of our management successes. The first one is this. The consistently high levels of interagency coordination among the EOC, the Governor's Office, the RMDF, the police, the scientists, and later the MVO, we always had scientists, but notice I'm saying later the MVO deliberately. Then the ministries responsible for health, public works, education, agriculture, housing, social services, the Port Authority, the Water Authority, and Monleg. Another success was the establishment of an on-island monitoring system as early as it was in the piece, and the rapid evolution of the MVO. The cooperation received from the NGO sector in Montserrat, especially the churches of all denominations, regarding the use of their buildings, as limited as they were and not designed for the purpose, for use as shelters. You've heard already the role played by Radio Montserrat from the very first night until now. Even now, Radio Montserrat is broadcasting this live. That means our people, wherever they are in the world, have an opportunity to hear this directly, unfiltered, as it is happening. And for that, I commend Radio Montserrat. I am particularly pleased because at one time, Radio Montserrat came under my purview as well. And the progress that the station continues to show, I know it's a little bit off point, is very, very important to Montserrat and for me personally. Now, the relationship between the scientists and the civil officials was a success. Remember, successful relationships are not about agreeing all the time. Successful relationships are based on professional respect and a willingness to listen, and a willingness to change an opinion based on advice or suggestions given. So that was unquestionably a success. For those of you who think about gender equity and the role of women, consistently more than 60% of the volunteers at the EOC were women. There are some of them who are performing exceptionally well still in the public sector of Montserrat. And I wish I could have had the opportunity to go through the whole list of names here today, but it's not the occasion. But I hope that we will find a way to remember, recognize those people. And I may return to that briefly towards the end. One of the successes, you heard the Premier and the former governor speak about the amount of time they spent sharing public information. But that was not the only format. We had developed by November of 1995, both an official's guide to evacuations and a residence guide. The residence guide was distributed to each occupied household at the time. Each occupied household got a copy. It was not a case of saying, hey, we're producing these copies, we're putting them in the supermarket, if you go by there, pick it up. No. We specifically and deliberately went to each home. And for that, the National Youth Council on this island should be applauded because they volunteered to take those guides to each home. We had risk maps developed with the scientists. We had regular newsletters. We had scientific summaries. All of that was produced. I am assuming that the records are still intact and they're available. Another success, the teamwork that existed at the EOC with special technical advisors from the UK, and I'll call three names: Alan Matthews, John Adlam, and John Rooney. They worked with us like we worked among ourselves as local people. And that's why I'm calling the names. Another success, the consistency of the face-to-face public information programs that brought scientists in direct contact with the community without administrative filters of any kind. The order and discipline with which, I'll need the presentation back up towards the end, so just make sure we don't have a technical challenge, right? Okay. Those are just definitions you can look at and we can move on. The order and discipline that was maintained at emergency shelters. By November of 1995, we had shelter rules with legal authority. And those shelter rules served us well on this island for more than 10 years. Those shelter rules were drafted largely by, at the time, two young Montserratian barristers. As she was then Eulalie Greenaway, and as he still is now George Kernan. The fact that emergency regulations were put in place early, and there have been issues associated with emergency regulations about level of force that is reasonable in emergencies and all of that. But the fact is we had them. You heard mention of Horatio Truitt earlier on today, the late Horatio Truitt. But the management of logistics and the high levels of accountability for food, fuel, meant that we were able to provide assistance, direct food assistance, for 5,000 persons for 6 months. Subsequently, on the food voucher program, we were able to assist 3,500 persons for 5 months. Thank you. Essential services such as water, telephone, electricity, broadcasting were regularly maintained with only limited interruptions. High-quality institutional care was provided for a substantial proportion of the aged and infirm population. Montserrat earned admiration for that, and it continues to earn admiration for how we cared for the aged. The evacuations were largely executed successfully, except for a couple of cases, before eruptive events. Warnings were timely and essentially erred on the side of safety. A search and rescue unit was established, and that search and rescue unit was able to rescue many people in desperate circumstances throughout those early years. Emergency food was always available. And part of the reason why it was always available is a system that was put in place to track the availability of food so that timely decisions could be taken if those supplies went low. The role played by the district committees in Montserrat at the time, there were 13 committees when we started. And each of those committees had its own management structure, and each did a tremendous job, especially with regard to shelter management. Notwithstanding the limitations of facilities, when it came to the management of the facilities, those committees did a wonderful job. Now, overall, when I think back to some of the, and I'm not going to go into details now, apart from time, it might not be wise. We had arrangements which allowed us to have essential vehicles always fueled. And in that regard, at this moment, I just pause and say a very hearty thank you to the Lindsay family. I remember myself knocking on the Lindsay's door at 3 o'clock in the morning because we were going to have an evacuation later that day, and saying to them, we're going to need the gas station opened. And you thought you would have heard a few choice phrases coming back at you saying, carry yourself to some convenient place where you don't want to carry yourself. It never happened. Said, okay, give us a half an hour and we'll open. That's the kind of spirit that existed in Montserrat at that time. So, those are successes, and of course I'm doing this presentation basically by just doing highlights now. But challenges. We needed to replace the critical economic infrastructure. So much of it had been lost. Perhaps over 90% of the critical economic infrastructure effectively was rendered unusable. There was reluctance by residents in some areas, and you've heard this already, to move. We had some well-documented cases. One case in Spanish Point, almost a near tragedy in Spanish Point, with a young child because of it. There were major social sector challenges, such as caring for special needs cases, because we didn't have facilities designed essentially for special needs cases. I don't know if H.E. remembers, but there was one day, I don't think that I often lost my cool then, but I lost it one day when I discovered that a paraplegic was being left alone in gauges. And the only thing I thought could have worked was to ask the governor at the time to use his authority to say, we have to find a place, I'm not going to call the place that refused to take him. Suffice it to say, when I called H.E., and he said, okay, Frankie, all right, I understand, take it easy. And he called the place, and they took the goodly gentleman in. Those were the kinds of issues and challenges that were faced. The acquisition of tools, equipment, and assets. You've heard the governor say already that not every decision that was taken in terms of technical assistance went well. We have a famous experience in Montserrat with some buses that we ended up calling trains. Some school buses from the United States, for those of you who have been here, and our roads over here have been improved significantly since the eruption. When those buses came, without the appropriate consultation with us, we recognized that there was going to be a huge challenge. But we didn't run around and fuss and kick up and say this can't happen. You know what we did? We said we're going to make best use of them. These can carry about 50 or 60 people. When we need them for evacuations, what we're going to do, put the smaller buses inside the villages, and the smaller buses will ferry people out, if necessary, to the bigger buses, to the trains, and we can move more people faster. But I'm using that as an illustration of the way we thought, the mindset. It was a solution-focused, a results-focused mindset. The crisis created a sociologically unsettled environment, and it would have been good to have had the opportunity to go into greater detail, but there are lots of people who suffered mentally because of this. And we didn't have the specialist capacity, the specialist facilities. I know what it is like to look someone in the eye, because it happened, and hear the person, when they heard the helicopter coming in, saying, the legions are coming to rescue me. This was a person up until a few weeks ago seemed to have been fine. The legions are coming to rescue me. Simply from the sound of the helicopter. Those were the realities and the challenges. Now, in terms of lessons, and forgive me, but I have to run through these rather quickly. Every Caribbean country should be prepared for natural as well as man-made hazard situations that can become disasters, and set up appropriate policies, strategies, programs, and management arrangements, especially for high-impact hazards and threats. Now, we know that sometimes the probability is low, but the impact is high. That's one of the lessons we learned in Montserrat, and one of the lessons the rest of the region can learn. Small island economies are especially vulnerable to natural disasters, as if we didn't know that already. But again, it's a lesson that we have to repeat because we keep missing the boat on that point. People are willing to endure great hardships, but they demand effective leadership at all levels. That is a lesson we learned in Montserrat. And let me just say, these two gentlemen sitting in front here who spoke earlier on, Montserrat was lucky that we had them at the time. Because that relationship based on professional respect meant that, for example, at midnight, your leader was coming with elements of the response team to sit at Long Ground with people from Long Ground 1.5 miles away from the volcano when people said they were hearing rock-breaking sounds. To sit and engage and talk. And then when the rock-breaking sound subsided and the scientists felt, okay, we're not going to have any more activity tonight, it might be 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, then we will come back down and continue work. That's the kind of leadership that we saw. These two gentlemen focused on policy and strategy, and they left me to deal with operations. They didn't interfere. They trusted me. They didn't always agree with me, and they didn't always take my advice on every single thing. And there are times when I tried to say, H.E., you cannot replace 400 public officers with 40 people at the AOC. And he gave me an answer which made it difficult for me to go beyond that. He said, Frankie, that might be so, but I know one thing for sure. If I ask you and your team to do it, it's going to get done. I had to shut up and get on with it. Now, the other lessons. Effective responses in large-scale disasters can require political approaches which are fundamentally values-based, equitable, and altruistic. If not, chaos will arise and people will suffer. I wish I had time to really explore that one some more, given what we went through. Another challenge. We don't think that any island of comparable size to Montserrat, we don't think that any island will be able to make it through on its own. Preparations should be made to deal with those unquantified but very significant psychological and emotional effects of a disaster. We haven't yet learned to get good at that yet in the region, in my humble opinion. And I hope we start getting better soon. Management of aid in terms of infrastructure, targets, timing, delivery, commissioning of plant and equipment is fraught with challenges. And so, from those challenges, let me very quickly touch on some recommendations. The first one, the work of the Regional Disaster Management Organization, CDMA, should be far more closely integrated into our national development plans. A new comprehensive all hazards assessment project should be undertaken in all countries in the region. All Caribbean countries that are prone to volcanic events should ensure that they develop and maintain contingency plans that include volcanic scenarios. That was a lesson we learned. Thankfully, as H.E. Savage already said, we had revised the EOC guidelines that year, and it was the EOC guidelines that became the core of our contingency response, including the officials' guide. The expertise which has been developed in Montserrat should be regarded as a regional resource. We're not going to be around forever. Those of us who had the challenges and issues and hopefully, on the record, overcame many, many of them. We're not going to be around forever. We're a resource to the region. And we should be engaged and employed in that regard. You heard what H.E. said. He has been fortunate enough to go back to England and help people in England prepare for disaster impacts based essentially on his Montserrat and to some extent BVI experience. But what have we done similarly in this region? How many times has the Honorable Prime Minister been asked to engage with young people in the national disaster offices of this region? I could ask the obvious question in relation to a certain former permanent secretary, but I won't. But I'll just make the point here. We now have resources, knowledge, and expertise. I hope he'll forgive me, but the current head of our emergency department in Montserrat, he started as a private in the Defense Force. Now he's the commanding officer of the Defense Force, and the emergency department is under his leadership. So Montserrat itself has set an example, using its own knowledge, skills, and experience to continue preparing for the future. All Caribbean countries that are prone to those events should expedite the development of the plans. Now, I'll say many of the photographs you see here going forward now, and I'm moving very quickly, of course, were very kindly donated. People make contributions in different ways. You heard mention of Kevin West's name before. Kevin kindly allowed me to use these photographs, but he stipulated, and now the clicker is sticking, that we must only use them for today's presentation. So please help me to keep that. If you see a photograph coming up that you like, please be reminded that we only have permission to use it today. This was a framework that we created in the EOC in November 1995. It has resulted in me in a variety of capacities since leaving Montserrat having a management framework to use in a whole variety of disaster management situations. And I will now move on to showing you. I'll just pause here. For those of you who recognize that church, it's the Anglican Church in Harris Hills, Montserrat. And I can't dwell, but I'll tell you quickly. My wife was baptized in that church. Our children were baptized in that church. We got married in that church. Think about what it feels to look back at that, knowing that her grandparents and her baby brother were buried in that churchyard, which we cannot now go back and see. So when we talk about the impact of the volcano in Montserrat on its people, these are the kinds of pictures we need to show you and tell you about. This came from the actual official's guide and just took it to illustrate that it's there, and for those of you who could get hands on the guide, you'll see it there like that. Now, see if you can recognize anybody there. I don't have a pointer, but look in the front row. You see two people there who are in this room, but you might struggle to recognize us now 30 years later. That was the core of the EOC team at the time. And behind us were what we were very pleased to have, our then offices and functional areas, porta cabins. And we were pleased to have them in comparison to what we had before, because what we had before were tents and old bars from Plymouth. Now, I'm closing off by pointing out that in my work at CARICAD, it has overlapped because of my experience in disaster management. And I came up with this framework for CARICAD, which says, essentially, when it comes to managing crises, we need to think about PPT. PPT. We need to plan, we need to prepare, and we need to perform. In performing, we need to do all the good things that we've been discussing. And when it comes to transforming, we really need to think about moving forward and improving, building back much, much better, building forward much, much better. Wow, don't know what happened there. Should have been in English, wasn't in English originally. But in essence, the original part of this would have shown you the things that we need to focus on for preparation. And as you see here, during the crisis, and I can't stay to go through each of these, but you will see, for example, be, know, and do, with have, taken from the US military, is a framework that CARICAD has embraced to encourage disaster management across this region. And I'm saying CARICAD, not CDMA, because it's not within that confine. It's within this context of public sector management. Look at B. Be values-led. Be genuine. Be the example, especially in showing courage and mental strength. Premier, Governor, you see yourself there? Go right down that column. Professional, accountable, disciplined, organized, and creative. And again, you can go right across. Now, this presentation, both presentations, text and, we'll just have to check what happened with the first slide, is with the team, the local team, so that those who may wish to get this part of it you can use fine. It's the photographs we'll be challenged with. But you can look at this and take your time, and you see now, same principles, be, know, have, and do, from the US military, be, know, do, was their original concept. And somebody said, but Frankie, why are you all talking about have? Why you don't take the US military, be, know, do? And I said, you think the US military has a serious problem about wanting things and not getting it? In our experience, there are a lot of things that we might want to have to work with that are very difficult to get. That is why we put the have there. And if you look at the have, for example, priorities, new communication strategy, strategy for the politics. Wish we had time for that one to discuss that, since we have politicians here who have been through crises and led through crises. Introduce new systems. Those are the kinds of things. So, just a quick highlight of the successes and a couple of closing tips for leaders. Remember, you're not a super person, eh? Some of us had to learn that. Still only 24 hours in a day. If you don't sleep for 2 days, the third day, it'll be a different story. Again, not time to go through, but as a result of what we're doing, because what we're trying to do is learn lessons from the past to go forward. This is a schema that we've created at CARICAD in terms of resilience to natural hazards. And again, this is available to you. It shows, for example, mitigation should go into continuous consultation and engagement. And you go right across, and you just follow the arrows, and you see, you end up with your long-term responses and your reporting and documentation. And again, just build this up a little bit. And ladies and gentlemen, this was the condensed version. I thank you very much for the privilege and opportunity. My first invitation to be here for something like this in 30 years. I'm very grateful to it. And I'll just close by saying, when you don't live in a place for 25 years and you come in and the immigration officer who greets you says, "Welcome home," you know it's home. You know it's still nice. You know it's still paradise. I said earlier, this is a very emotional experience for me. Part of the reason why it's so emotional is that several people whose faces you would have seen in that photograph are no longer with us. And the others, district chairmen. I wish there was a way that we could have recorded their contribution permanently. I hope there's a way we can find where, even if it's putting their names in granite someplace, that at least we can have their names in granite so that their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who come after them will at least be able to go and point to a stone and say, "I know my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother contributed to this effort." I'm not sure what we have in terms of time for questions now, but if we don't have any more time, I'd simply say, thank you very much. I hope that this has been useful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Mr. Franklin Michael for sharing such a passionate experience with us. We do have time for about 2 questions before we take a break. So we'd invite the audience to answer any question, to ask any questions that they may have.
Good morning. Thank you for your excellent presentation. You mentioned briefly the psychological impacts that this eruption has had on people in Montserrat, and if you can kind of elaborate on what you've experienced.
I think many of us have this idea that no matter what we go through, and again, part of it is history, eh? For us in this part of the world, part of it is history. No matter what we go through, somehow psychologically, we're going to be okay. And I know I was taught that as a child, and I know I'm not the only one. And the idea that these situations can affect you in such a way that your mental health isn't what it was before, and you may have issues and challenges, we don't really prepare ourselves appropriately for that. I mean, I don't want to point to myself specifically to make an example, but it's the best one to use if we're talking about something like this. If you work 7 days a week for 4 months, there has to be some kind of psychological impact. And that's why I use that example, because it's one I lived. If you go into a shelter and you are without privacy, and you're 25 years old and you just got married the year before, there is going to be a psychological impact which may very well shake the relationship between yourself and your wife. Those are the issues that we couldn't, quote unquote, fix, but they are effects that we now, as a country, have to look back and say, well, okay, how best, going forward, can we treat with these? The same way Montserrat now has 4 persons at PhD level in earth sciences related to volcanology, is this now a time to be looking at people who have those kinds of skills, those psychosocial skills that we may need? Well, we always need them in a way, but need them in the future. Okay?
Frankie,
Yes, sir.
do you know if there has been any estimation of the cost of the disruption, socioeconomic, expressed in dollars and cents, in economics? And secondly, the cost of the scientific input in paralleling the whole situation. What is it costing the government of Montserrat and even the UK, or the government of the UK through Montserrat, to provide scientific support, and what exactly is the target disruption that you're dealing with? Is there any sources available, or maybe that's something we can talk about later?
Since we can talk about later, since I'm not personally aware, but I'm sure that the 2 gentlemen sitting there would be in a better position than me if there is such documentation. And I'm accustomed to doing this. When it's at a certain level, push it right back up. And this one I'm pushing back up for you all to share discussion with over lunch. Okay? Thanks. Is that it? I know we are pressed for time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be here through the week. And if there are questions that we didn't have time for you to raise now, please feel free. All you have to do is just come to me and say, look, if I had time, this is a question I would have asked. And I'd still like to hear your response. So thank you very much once again.
I'd like to say a final thank you to our esteemed guest speakers and keynote speakers. We will now have a 10-minute break. If you can join us in the reception area, there will be refreshments available to you. Just a 10 minutes break, and then we will resume our program. Thank you kindly.